Welcome to the Bible Savvy Podcast, a weekly conversation about how to understand, enjoy, and apply God's Word. It's time to jump into a new passage from the Bible Savvy reading plan.
Hello and welcome to the Bible Savvy Podcast. I'm here with Pastor Courtney and Pastor David.
How we doing?
David's got a question for us.
I do have a question. Every once in a while, this comes up, for me at least, where people ask me this, and I was wondering what your answer would be for it. But if you weren't a pastor and God did not call you to vocational ministry, okay, so keep that in mind. What would you most likely be doing occupationally? So what kind of job do you imagine you'd be doing if this weren't your calling to do this, right?
Yeah. Should we pick for each other? I think we talked before,
okay.
like cross-country coach.
Okay, I like it.
That's good. Librarian.
Yeah.
I was going to say
would do that.
professor, which was what I was guessing your answer would be.
Yeah. So it wouldn't, like, assuming I couldn't just go teach ministry somewhere.
Correct.
Like that feels like
that's yeah.
I would probably want to be like a high school history teacher. Professor is also good because I like college students. Like that is a sweet spot for me. But I probably would really enjoy teaching at least teenagers anything about history, maybe literature, but more likely history. So before I was called into ministry, I thought I was on the path of like science, engineering, math kinds of things. That's what I was good at. But I think I would have probably enjoyed some kind of teaching better. So it's not very far
Cool,
from
Mr.
what I do.
Keenan.
I mean, honestly, this is what I'm trying to do here. It's like just ancient history, you know?
That's good.
You got it. Yeah, you said cross-country coach. I actually have two answers. One does involve like running. I would love to be one of the people who's like an announcer for like the Olympics or like things like that. Like, you know, like a running sportscaster. That would be fun. And I think I'd be pretty good at it.
They're still going in a straight line.
But
They're still putting one foot in front of the other.
Turning left.
Look at how
left.
look at
Oh, hey.
Did you see how high that knee got?
wow.
Oh my goodness, left, right. No, for real though, my genuine first answer is I would be a midwife. A doula and a midwife. I actually, I used to doula, help people with
No
through the
way.
birthing process.
Yeah.
And I
can see you doing that.
love it. It's super fun to do. And
Wow.
it's the most amazing, like sacred moment to like welcome life into the world.
Like
and
early childhood pastor.
That's good.
Yes, that is my genuine answer. I would be a
awesome.
midwife and deliver babies.
So speaking of like commentating, actually in college, my on-campus job during college was, and I got to be the guy on the microphone announcing the basketball and volleyball games.
That's cool.
And I got paid to scream into a microphone. And I thought it was the greatest gig ever. So,
Yeah.
But at the time, I thought I was going to go. This is again before feeling full confirmation. My calling to ministry was sports journalism and either writing about it or doing broadcasts or something. Just communication in general. I always enjoyed and I loved sports. However, today I would not. I don't think I would pursue that. I actually think, and I've joked with my wife that I'm doing this at some point in our lives, is that I want to open a board game cafe.
Oh, yes.
I want to open a coffee shop that's like good coffee
Yep.
and food and also just great games,
That's
board
right.
games
Yeah,
and
I like
community. And I've always wanted to just like get a couple of friends and open one of these and
Do it.
because I love community. I love creating community. So it is part of like my job,
Yeah,
right? It's sort of, you talked about you're kind of cheating. I'm kind of cheating too. I love gathering people together to connect and have good conversation. I feel like there's what better way to do that than a board game cafe.
Let's do it. I love it. All right, we are in Leviticus chapter 19. This is smack in the heart of the book. Just a little reminder of context, okay? The book of Leviticus is all about what happens when God moves into town, okay? So God is told the people, build a tabernacle. I'm going to come live in that place and you're going to have access to me. And so now the people are living in the neighborhood with God there, and it has all sorts of implications. I sort of think of it, if the White House moved to your town, if the Capitol moved to your town, things would change in your town, right? You'd have to behave differently, drive differently, interact with people differently. There would be things that are different about being in the Capitol. So what does it look like when God's palace shows up, essentially? And so there are behavioral implications that get spelled out. What does it mean to be a holy people? If you want to be around God, this is what it looks like. So chapter 19 has a whole bunch of laws. It's a relatively long chapter. We're going to read the whole thing because it's got a whole kind of potpourri of different things that are covered in that. And we'll try to unpack it. Some of these are going to sound very accessible. Others are going to be a lot more strange. So we want to get them all.
The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, 'Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Each of you must respect your mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. When you sacrifice a fellowship offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It shall be eaten on the day you sacrifice it, or on the next day. Anything left over until the third day must be burned up. If any of it is eaten on the third day, it is impure and will not be accepted. Whoever eats it will be held responsible because they have desecrated what is holy to the Lord. They must be cut off from their people. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. Do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Keep my decrees. Do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. If a man sleeps with a female slave who is promised to another man, but who has not been ransomed or given her freedom, there must be due punishment. Yet they are not to be put to death because she had not been freed. The man, however, must bring a ram to the entrance of the tent of meeting for a guilt offering to the Lord. With the ram of the guilt offering, the priest is to make atonement for him before the Lord for the sin he has committed, and his sin will be forgiven. When you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years you are to consider it forbidden. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all its fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat its fruit. In this way, your harvest will be increased. I am the Lord your God. Do not eat any meat with the blood still in it. Do not practice divination or seek omens. Do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Do not degrade your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Stand up in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. I am the Lord. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord.
All right. There is a lot there.
You're telling me.
And some of those things, like I said, are going to be things that we say, oh, yeah, and other things we're scratching our heads about. So let me start by giving just a couple of principles when we're reading the law, okay? The first is this. You always got to take it in its cultural context. There are some things here that seem strange or offensive to us simply because we live in another culture, and so the kind of baseline expectations are different. And so things that seem obvious to people then seem very strange to us now. Second thing is always try to look for principles behind things. A lot of them are very specific, right? But there are things that you say, if you abstract an idea from this of saying, what's the heart behind it, the principle behind it, that gets you a lot farther than just thinking about the particular example that's given. Always be thinking, third thing is always be thinking about what changes in the New Testament. There are certain laws that because of what Jesus has done are applied differently or no longer are very directly applicable to us, and others that are very directly applicable. And so you got to say, does the New Testament say anything about this? And then the fourth thing is use your imagination and think about analogies. There may be situations that are not identical to this, but there's a similar parallel kind of situation where you would say, oh, this is like that. The laws were not given to be like our written codes, like our legal codes, which are like, here is the exact like logical whatever that's going to apply to the situation. These are more like when you read a proverb, and a proverb can be applied in lots of different ways. So you've got to use your imagination to say, where does this law have implications into multiple areas of life? So we're going to try and do that with some of the ones that we've got here. So let's hear, what are your observations about all these laws?
All right, my first observation was right at the beginning of verse 2, where, Lord said to Moses, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. So when I read that and then I started reading everything else, I sort of had this like picture of like my old English teacher and the way she would make us write papers of like, what's your thesis? And then what are your supporting arguments? And, So I'm seeing bullet points as I'm sitting here. And so as I read this, it seemed to me that the Lord was saying, this is my thesis. I want you to be holy. I want you to be set apart because I'm set apart. So like, end the sentence, big fat period. And so in light of that, here's a bunch of things that are going to help us chase this. So in my mind, it made sense, the structure of what God is doing here by starting with that statement. If you just grab a verse out of here and you're like, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block from the blind. It's like, where did that come from? Like, well, if God wants you to be holy, and this is something that people are doing in culture, and he wants to be set apart, it made sense to me that that's how we're starting this whole long line of laws.
Yeah, it's a good idea that brings it all together. Yeah.
And I think, too, the other thing that I was really struck with is the idea of, as you were saying, like, it's not the law like we would, have a list of laws when you go to the pool, or here's the rules that you can't run, you can't do this, you can't do that, but that the Israelites would see this like, this is how we get to live in relationship with God, like this is how we get to do that, and not necessarily as a like, I didn't see it as somebody sitting there going, ugh, another law and another law and another law, but it's like, so how do we do this? Like, what do we get to do is kind of the way that I think even just that setup first sentence reads to me is like, okay, lean in because this is how we get to be in God's presence.
Yeah. Yep. When we've talked about how God moving into the neighborhood is a way of saying like Eden is back, right? Like access to God, being able to come into his presence is here. There's also something about your lifestyle that says, well, we're going to live more whole. You know what I mean? Like something that's more life-giving, more harmonious the way it was meant to be in Eden, you're getting a little more of that. And so to actually say, how do these contribute to wholeness in a person's life or in your community is really, and so it's a get to, not a have to in most of these cases. Because it's like, well, I get to live like it was Eden. Oh, that's a good thing, right?
Yeah. The other thing that I did, and I wrote this, really what you said at the top of my page, what's the underlying value of each law? And so as I went down, I started writing, God is holy, God is pure. God is generous. God is, and like trying to think, okay, what is that underlying value of that law? What does it tell me about who God is as I'm reading through? And that just helped me to kind of frame it out as I was reading through and making observations.
Because if you get to be like God, then it must somehow reflect something that God is like. Yeah, that's great. I like that.
Okay, another observation I had is there are a lot of repeated laws from the Ten Commandments in this setting. And so it kind of made me question about why the need for repetition. And then I started to think about my role as a parent. And I'm like, well, I kind of get it, because goodness knows my kids have heard the same thing over and over. And sometimes I repeat certain laws of the house because I know they're most likely to be disobeyed. Like, hey, don't lie. It's like, don't lie, because this is going to happen often, and the heart is very sinful even at age 4, or because I know the consequences are so dire. Like, hey, look both ways before you cross the street. I said that a million times, not because they're going to break it, but if they break it one time, the consequence is so bad. So it did make me question: is that what God's doing? Is it kind of like a father saying, okay, I just want to make sure I'm going to double down, I'm going to repeat these things because I know the human heart, or if there's something else here going on?
Yeah, I don't know if there's something else going on. I do think it's some of what you're talking about, where there's just reiteration because it's important for various reasons. There could also be things in different contexts, right? Like, so the Ten Commandments is them standing at the foot of the mountain before they are officially entering the covenant. And in some ways, it's like a cover letter, right? Like, it's saying, here's the offer. Like, this is the commitment. If you're in, you need to know. And so it's the high level summary of saying, this is what it looks like.
Okay.
So that's a certain context. This is a context of saying, all right, you've got the tabernacle here, and I'm going through this comprehensive description of what it looks like to live with me in my presence. Same things are applying, but I'm telling you now. You know what I mean? You're now accepted the job. You're doing it. I'm giving you those instructions again. So some of it's context.
Okay, sure.
But I do think you're right. There are just things God needs to say over and over and over again, because unlike my children, we don't always listen.
Nice.
Another just principle that I wrote that isn't a specific observation, but I kept thinking of the psalmist who said things like, I delight in the law, and I long for the law, and I meditate on the law, and thinking again of those words in relationship to a list of rules or things that were repeated. I kept thinking that if that is in my mind as I read these things, then I'm reading them maybe a bit more in context, and seeing like, why would he delight in these things? Why would the psalmist long for the law, delight in the law, meditate on the law, hold it so sacred and see it as such a beautiful thing? So another just general observation.
Yeah.
Well, I want to dig into some of the particular laws here. It gets interesting when you start to see some of them. I'll just start with one that struck me. The verse 14, do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. I thought that was so interesting. I mean, there's a certain amount of like, this just sounds like normal courtesy, right? Like you don't trip people. But there's the sensitivity to say, it's almost like the principle behind it is there are certain people that you could get away with doing things to. You could take advantage of people, and they would have a harder time literally seeing it coming or having recourse because they're more vulnerable. And God's deliberately saying, just because you could get away with it doesn't mean you can, right? Like you don't do that. And to say, but fear your God, right? Yeah. Like, look, if I trip you, I might be afraid of you, right? Like you might come at me. But if someone is going to have a hard time getting back at me, then who do I fear to keep me in check? Well, it's not necessarily that person, but it's God who's looking out for them. Meaning God has special care for people who would be taken advantage of.
Yep. And it's in a similar vein, in just verses 9 and 10, where he just says, "Hey, when you're harvesting, you're going to leave the edges of the field for the poor and the vulnerable." Like that's just that's so specific. But you see it's time and time again. Again, we talk about observation, truths about God is one of the treats, right? So I felt like a truth about God was that God cares for the vulnerable. God's heart for justice is very real. And it's very interesting reading this if you have context for reading other parts of Scripture, like you read in the book of Ruth, how Boaz actually practices the law and he leaves the edges of his field, and that's how Ruth gets food. And there's very real applications of this verse that Boaz took seriously, and it impacted the line of Jesus. So I love reading stuff like that.
Well, I read a book about Leviticus when we started reading Leviticus, just because that's how I do things, right? But it was talking about some of the cultural stuff behind it, and they commented on these laws. I'd always thought, okay, if you got a big field and you're harvesting and you leave some of the extra, I was picturing someone, okay, you've got a field, so you're wealthy, you've got a lot of food, and so you can leave some of your excess. You don't need it. But what the person said is they've actually done calculations of how many calories you would get in the ancient world. Like in this context, they estimated you would be 60 days a year short. Like if you add up total calories that you get within 1 year, it amounts to 2 whole months short of what you would need for full health, which means the average person, even if they had land, would want all of those corners, right? They would need it. And to say it's not, well, if you have a lot of extra, then you can give away. It's saying, no, you may not have a lot of extra, but you're going to make sure even with that, the person who has even less is still going to be taken care of. Yeah. Like that's really incredible. Yeah. There's a faith that goes to that too.
Yeah. Something that was maybe a little bit of a question, something striking, you might call it even, is in verse 20 through 22, kind of a weird law to put in there. You can maybe explain a little bit more about the law, but the thing that was really striking to me is just the end there. His sin will be forgiven.
So summarize what the law is, because we read it a while back.
Yeah. If a man sleeps with a female slave who's promised to another man, but who has not been ransomed or given her freedom, there must be due punishment. Yet they are not to be put to death because she had not been freed. And then the man has to bring a ram to the entrance of the tent of meeting for a guilt offering. With the ram, atonement's made, and his sin is forgiven. These are the kinds of sins that we often tend to hold as unforgiven. I mean, if we're being really honest, that was my kind of observation there. Is I thought, that's significant that the atonement can be made and he can be forgiven, and it's named out there very publicly that would be a value of God, that he would say his sin is forgiven. But I did put a question mark next to the whole.
The whole situation feels a little funky.
The situation feels a little funky. Yeah. I appreciate the forgiveness.
All right.
Does it not feel like one of those things where a rule's been made because there's one person in the camp who did a thing, and now it's the John rule because because of John, right?
John did that. So this is one that is disturbing. Well, there's a certain amount of okay, you're addressing a thing because it's unjust and something you've done. But the fact that the situation is there bothers a lot of people when they read it, right? So first of all, you've got a slave, right? He's sleeping with a slave. And then that slave has been promised to another man. That whole first phrase feels like everything about that's wrong, right? So there are a few things to remember. And just as a little side note here, I'm actually doing a bonus episode about the difficult laws. I've got a friend who is an Old Testament scholar, and by this I mean a literal friend, he was my college roommate. And so we're going to do some Hey Clayton with my friend. We're going to talk about some particular laws. So we may get to one like this. I don't know if this one's on the list, but he'll help explain some of the slavery stuff. I'm counting on it. Ben, you better deliver, man.
I'm laughing thinking about the college roommate stories that could come out in this. Yeah. We'll be listening to that one. We're listening to that one.
But a couple of things to remember. First of all, slavery in the ancient world was a given. So we think of it as a horrible thing we have now overcome. But they would have thought of it as fairly typical pretty much everywhere. And so you're just dealing with reality. This is something that would have existed. Second, slavery was mostly about debt, not about race. Okay, so they weren't going and kidnapping people from other countries like in the African slave trade. This was people who were part of the community. They'd fallen on hard times. In order to get out of that, they indentured themselves to another person for a limited period of time, usually 7 years. But still, it was not just employment. It's not just getting a job from your neighbor. This was slavery. But that was a given in their culture. So it's regulating what existed. In terms of the female slave, okay, so the other thing that's a given in that culture is that marriages are arranged. And we think of that as deeply problematic, but in pretty much every culture before the last 150 years, it would have been considered like, yeah, okay, that's kind of how it goes. And if you were the head of the household and you had a young woman, even if she was a servant in your home, you would be responsible for making those kinds of decisions. So the promise to a man thing is essentially betrothed, right? And granted, she was your slave, so we think that's weird, but they would have thought, no, this is someone in your household, and so you get to help make decisions about whether or not she's going to be engaged to this man. And so the question here is essentially this: is this a case of premarital sex, what we would call fornication, or is this a case of someone who is engaged to someone else sleeping with somebody and therefore adultery? And there is a difference in terms of consequences for those things. And this law is essentially saying, hey, here's the situation. Here's how you play it out, because this is engagement, so it should be adultery, and therefore there's these consequences for the person involved. That's a long way around of saying God knows people are messed up, right? Like, it's more than just the general. The truth is, if you had a female slave, the odds of someone in that household taking advantage of her or doing something wrong are not low. And so he's saying we got to address that.
Yeah.
We could just mention the tattoo marks. You want to go into that one?
I don't know. I don't know. Pastor Jim listens to this sometimes.
Jim, we got to tell you something. Bad news, buddy.
Bad news.
How about this?
People are asking.
All right, I'm going to make a promise to the Bible Savvy Nation. I am going to do a Hey Clayton with Pastor Jim, and I will ask him about the tattoos and why he got the tattoos.
The way you said that, I thought you were saying, I'm going to get a Hey Clayton tattoo.
A Hey Clayton tattoo. Bible Savvy Nation.
I was like, whoa, hold on. Yeah.
No. I'll get Jim to answer that question.
Yeah.
So
I like
that's
it.
good.
I like it.
Okay, so one of my observations, verse 17 feels a little different than the rest of them, because it says, do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share in their guilt. A lot of the other laws feel very practical, like don't trip a blind person, don't abuse your slave, don't defraud, like don't do there are actions. This is like a internal private thing that you could hate somebody and no one would ever know. And it's like, I hate Clayton, but Courtney doesn't know that. So am I really accountable to my hatred for Clayton? And God says, hey, no, this is the law. They're like, don't hold any hatred here, but speak your matters frankly and say the words out loud that you're internalizing. Like there is some modern day wisdom here of speak honestly, not passive aggressively, all these things. It just felt a little bit different than the rest of the laws. This is like an internal matter.
Yeah.
And not a behavior necessarily.
Yeah, I thought I was really struck by that. It was like, no, this has got to go down deep. We sometimes think, when Jesus showed up, he took all of the things that were on the outside and said, no, now you got to mean it, right? Like the Sermon on the Mount, like it's not just enough to not murder. You have to not, hate your brother, right? But it was always there. Like God always wanted it to be all the way down deep, right? The other thing that struck me on that is it says, rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share in their guilt. Like that's a really interesting one. We sometimes think your behaviors are yours, your behaviors are yours, but there's something about being in a community together, like God's community, that says if I see you doing something and I don't say something, if I don't actually say, David, I don't think that's a good thing, I'm actually buying in. I'm complicit in that because I could have and should have done that. And together we're supposed to protect each other from sin. And if we're not doing that, in some ways, we're tacitly endorsing.
Yeah. It's good.
That doesn't mean you go around telling everybody everything you see, but there is a certain responsibility to say, am I invested in, the holiness of the people around me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And what a difference that makes in setting them apart. That was my thought when I read that is, wow, that is something that sets them apart. That is something that I would say, I want to be a part of a community like that, where it goes a level deeper. I don't want to be a part of a community that follows all the rules, but I like the idea of being part of a community that says we care for each other enough to go that level deeper and to address that level deeper.
Yeah, that's cool.
The other connection to the New Testament that I saw here is in verse 18, right after that, where it says, don't seek revenge, don't bear a grudge, but love your neighbor as yourself. And so sometimes people will be like, we're New Testament people and we're all about love. And it's like, I don't know if you know where Jesus got that quote, right?
Yeah.
Like he didn't just like, hey, I came up with a thing right
He's
now.
kind of an Old Testament guy.
He's kind of an Old Testament guy. Jesus is pretty into Leviticus, so I think I'm like him.
That should be the name of this episode. Jesus was pretty into Leviticus.
Pretty into Leviticus. But it is really interesting that that right here at the heart of all of this is this principle that Jesus says, this is the one that ties it all together. And when you're confused about all the other things, this is the heart behind all the different stuff. I also think it says, I love that it's not just by itself. It actually says, don't seek revenge or bear a grudge. Like there's an alternative there of like, no, you're going to be tempted to harbor things and to have hatred in your heart. Don't do it.
Oh, verse 26 says pretty plainly, do not practice divination or seek omens. And then a couple verses later, it says, do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you'll be defiled by them. It reminded me of our conversation about Joseph back in Genesis, because he said, he took the cup. Don't you know that's the cup by which I do divination? We had a little conversation about what is this divination and why is Joseph doing it, who's supposedly the hero of this story. And so I just love that kind of ties it back like, hey, okay, now again, God has moved into the neighborhood. There are certain things and practices you might have picked up from other nations and people groups, and he just fairly clearly says this. It's like, okay, this may have happened, but don't do it anymore. And here's why: you will be defiled by them, which kind of made me think of Pastor Jim's message recently about banishing demons and just sort of the ways that we, expose ourselves to just spiritual evil. And and God is saying right here, like, don't do it because you will be defiled.
All right, verse 32. I got to give a shout out to one of my favorite groups here at Christ Community Church, and that's the Primetimers.
Yes.
It says right there, stand up in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. I'm the Lord. So I know my Primetimer friends listen to this.
Yeah.
Because they talk about it. So shout out to the Primetimers. They meet on Thursdays. If you're in that age group, you should be there. It's a party every Thursday.
So I don't know if the Primetimers who are listening know this, but it is pretty normal for the staff of this church to be like, look, if you can go hang out with the Primetimers, they are going, like, we like gossip about how wonderful it is to be around you. This is absolutely true. When new staff come in and I say, hey, if you ever get invited by Dwight to go hang out with the Primetimers, take it, because it will be a blast. They will encourage you. They will love you. Like, you guys do a good job making us feel really loved and a part of the community. So you should know that we really love you. I'm going to take the next verse here, 33. It says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, don't mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I'm the Lord your God. There is so much interesting in there, because it's pushing against the automatic tendency that we have to say, you're an outsider, and so I'm going to treat you differently. And it literally says, love them as yourself. When it talks about love your neighbor as yourself, it applies it very specifically to the person that you might think isn't your neighbor. Like you like in this context, the first time you hear love your neighbor, you're thinking, oh, like the other people in my community, fellow Israelites, like that's who I'm going to love them. But this is like, no, when someone comes along who isn't kind of part of the community, they don't own land here, they're not like, normally around, no, love them as yourself too. And then to add, because you were foreigners in Egypt, like this generation in particular knew, but all throughout history, the Israelites were supposed to remember, this is where we came from. There was a time when we were really mistreated as foreigners, so we'll never do that to people again. I just think it's a cool thing.
Yep.
All right, let's go on to one of the M's in common. Let's talk about message here. If you were going to grab a principle out of this passage, what would it be?
Mine's a little longer today. I wrote out, being holy reflects the character of our holy God and reveals our own devotion to his holy mission. Just that idea of holiness that continued through. And as I was writing down those characteristics of God, I was just struck that being holy reflects the character of our holy God. And then following those things reveals our own devotion to his holy mission.
Mine's basically the same, just shorter.
Oh, you got to do one better than me.
It's be holy as God is holy.
Oh,
it was just his,
it was just
he
like,
just took it. He just stole it straight from the page.
Yeah.
I love when
I do that sometimes.
I know. I do think sometimes
true.
in the common method, sometimes you're thinking about the message and like I felt like the big title thesis was be holy as I am holy,
Yes.
and there was all these subpoints. And so when I said, I'm like, I can't say it better than God. So Be holy as God's holy.
We're
That's
here
right.
we're here to represent the common man. Do you know that? You know that, right?
My message is this: holiness before God means looking out for the people who are most likely to be taken advantage of. And so I noted in this, like, you've got laws protecting the poor, the hired worker, people with disabilities, people who have been accused of crimes, your unsuspecting neighbor, your daughter, the elderly, foreigners, even places where it's protecting your customers, because it's saying, like, use honest weights and measures and stuff, right?
That's
like
good.
It's the moments when someone could be taken advantage of. Holiness means actually looking out for that side of the equation, not yours. All right, let's go on to the other M in comma, meditation. I'm going to give you 45 seconds to prayerfully ponder this verse 37. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord. All right, let's talk about the A in comma, application. What do you do in response to all this?
Well, I my message was be holy as I am holy. I'm kidding. That was David's message. My message was being holy reflects the character of our holy God and reveals our own devotion to his holy mission. And so I wrote out, Jesus saved us from the law, but we are still called to holiness. And so what do I need to change in my life to show I am fully following Jesus? What is that? What would that look like? And, you know, I think I do a pretty good job of, you know, following. I'm not going out and stealing things or, you know, things like that. But do I sometimes, you know, do some version of these things? Are there things in my life? Am I always acting as compassionately as I should? Am I, you know, revering the poor, and, you know, are those things happening in my life? And so my application is, I mean, pretty simple and obvious one to like look through and think, where are the places I could do better at that? Where are the places where I'm not living as someone set apart? Or I read somewhere the definition of holiness as utterly unique. And I thought, where would someone look at my life and say, well, that does not look utterly unique from the rest of the world?
That's good. So my message was be holy as God is holy. So my application was to ask my accountability partner if he sees anything in my life that doesn't look holy. So I was thinking about how easy it is to blend in with the world without realizing it. You know, God calls us to be set apart. So what if I have a blind spot that I'm unaware of because it's just existed for so long? I feel like for some Israelites hearing this, there may have been things in their community that existed for so long they didn't even realize, like, oh, didn't know that was bad. Like that was, I was just blending in. So, so I started to think, like, you know, what if I don't care about the poor like God instructs us to be? Or what if I'm holding hate in my heart towards someone that I don't realize? Or what if I got a tattoo with Pastor Jim last weekend and I need my accountability partner to, you know, call me out? Just kidding. I can't wait for that episode. But I think it's helpful to have someone else hold the magnifying glass up, someone who you trust, and say, like, well, what about this area? Or what about this? Or have you considered any of the many different topics that come out of this passage? So that was my application.
All right. My message was holiness before God means looking out for the people who are most likely to be taken advantage of. And the application for that is to ask the question, okay, where do I have the upper hand in a relationship? I think sometimes we go through life simply thinking about our, you know, goals and the things that we're aiming to do, and we don't always pay attention to the fact that there are places where we actually have the advantage. And sometimes those are subtle, right? Sometimes where it's like, I can make the decision and it'll just happen. So if you're in leadership, you can recognize some of those. But sometimes it's also like the place where I could get the final word, right? Like that you can like say, I'm going to get the last word on this, or I get to walk away from this and tell somebody about it, and they're going to believe my version of the account, or those sorts of things where you say, I actually have power in this situation. I have the upper hand in the situation. And it's almost as if God is saying, deliberately posture your life so that you never take advantage in a selfish way, right? Like, and look for those. But if you don't see them, right, if you're not recognizing that that's the case, you won't actually go about doing all these things, right? Looking out for someone who, well, you're older, and so it might be harder for you to do X, Y, Z. You have a disability, or you're in a social position that's harder, or whatever. Like, if we're not paying attention to that, we won't go over and above to say, I'm going to love them as I love myself.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Join us again next Monday for a new episode where we'll be looking at another passage from the Bible Savvy reading schedule. And in the meantime, if you're not following along with the reading plan, check out BibleSavvy.com. Also, you can subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Email us your questions or suggestions at podcast@BibleSavvy.com. Lastly, tell your friends, and we'll talk to you next week.